Mindset Forge, Episode 4. The Self in Self-Improvement. Self is the Lord of Self. Who else could be the Lord? With self well subdued, one finds a Lord such as few can find. The Buddha in Dhammapada, verse 160. Hello and welcome back to the 4th episode of Mindset Forge. Call me Laurent Lohale and let's get to it. The self is another subject most don't really think about too deeply, but it has still confounded thinkers, philosophers and scientists for millennia. I am not here to go through all the various theories and views on the subjects, nor to list every argument for and against a certain point of view. Like Nietzsche succinctly put it, there are no facts, only interpretations. The purpose of this podcast is practical benefit. I don't wish to just give you food for thought, but to provide you with food for body as well, meaning energy and resources to develop yourself in a real, practical way. That is why I will be representing a view of the self that lends it well towards self-improvement. It is a view supported by philosophy, science, from quantum physics to psychology, as well as common sense once the idea matures in your mind. A maladaptive understanding of the self leads directly to self-limiting beliefs, anxiety, depression and suffering and mindlessness. The way I see the self does away with all these problems and provides fertile ground for self-improvement, which is why I hope you and everyone else considers adopting it seriously. Just to be clear, it is not a theory I developed myself, but many great thinkers before me have worked on their own fields to arrive at the same solution, all from different starting points and directions. And when something like that happens, it is best to listen seriously. This winning view of the self, one that so well liberates us from unneeded suffering and promotes forging a better mindset, is that the self does not really exist and is a type of an illusion. Typically, the reaction of someone who has never heard anything like this before is, "But I'm right here." In a way, yes, you are. But what is that you? Is it your body? Let's say something happens to your brain, so your personality changes. Your body, at least on the outside, is the same. But is it you if that person acts completely differently? What if you lose your memory? Would it still be you? You think you control your behavior, but we know that people unconsciously mimic the gestures of people they meet. You have surely yawned just because someone yawned in front of you. People in groups find it difficult to go against that group. So your behavior and thinking is dictated by the people around you. Would you be who you are if you had different parents growing up, a different upbringing? The point I'm trying to make is that none of us is just me, since who we are is influenced by outside factors. Just like our thoughts and personality are affected by other people, our bodies are changed by outside factors like nutrients we receive, or if we are exposed to harmful substances, for example during gestation. How do we define the self? To be exact, it is commonly used to mean an entity outside and independent of our other qualities and surroundings, something unchanging. Other possible meanings for the term include one's conscious experience of being a unique person. It can mean the part of you that thinks thoughts and does deeds. Neuroscience studies which parts and networks produce the sense of self-awareness and other self-related functions. When you experience something, it seems like there is someone doing the experiencing, and that someone is the self. Take a moment to consider how you view yourself. What does it mean to be you? Because as I stated, my intention is to tear down this view, so by the end of this episode you should feel like you don't really even exist. And that is a good thing. And then our next trick will be to make something out of nothing. Next, I would like to go through different fields of science and what they have to say about our composition. By the time I am done, your belief in yourself as a separate, existing entity should be well and truly wrecked beyond belief and repair, at which point we can start rebuilding it from the ground up. Please enjoy and do take it as a learning experience rather than the ultimate existential horror there is. Let's start with what many consider to be the foundation of all science. Physics. According to some extreme reductionists, all other fields of science can, at least eventually, be explained with the rules of physics. But what does physics have to say about our composition? It is not a field that generally deals directly with humans or other animals for that matter, so what it has to say about us is the same as it says about all other matter and existence. And the latest, very promising explanation for matter is called the quantum field theory. Not something you would expect from a self-improvement podcast. Bear with me. In the end, my goal becomes apparent and I only have practical value in mind, and I won't tarry any longer on the subject or any subject than is necessary. The quantum field theory proposes that all particles are, in fact, waves in a field, and when those waves interact, we get matter and the fundamental forces of existence. So forget about those pictures of atoms and electrons from school books. It seems particles are not separate balls that bounce against one another, but waves in a continuous field, like waves in an ocean, all connected. All matter is comprised of the interaction of these fields, like many oceans interacting so their waves smash against one another. From this follows that as your body is comprised of matter, that just like the atoms that make you up, you are not a separate entity, but part of a field connecting everything in the universe. Your thoughts are transmitted by chemicals and electric signals, which are also excitations in that all-encompassing connected field. So, in the eyes of physics, your body and thoughts are part of a field, not separate entities that we are prone of thinking them as. So, according to cutting-edge physics, you are a wave in an ocean that does not realize that it is a wave. Hold that thought. Moving on the scientific ladder, we get to chemistry, the direct descendant of physics. Again, the scope of chemistry is much wider than just the study of humans, but we can still apply the chemistry mindset to humans. So, put on your chemistry glasses and take a deep look into the question, am I a separate entity? Is there a self? I am no chemist, but I'd say the answer is no. We are made of the elements of the periodic table. There is no human being without carbon, oxygen and the like. Break everything apart to its atoms, and a human would not be discernible from another human, or a tree, and so on. There would be nothing that would mark this batch of atoms as Laurent Lohale. You are not even separate from your surroundings. Every few seconds you draw in breath while breathing out carbon dioxide. That oxygen becomes part of you. You take in food that is broken down to simpler molecules and assimilated into your makeup or used for energy in the form of another molecule. ATP. You are surrounded by molecules of the air, stone, wood and metal making up the buildings, dirt or asphalt or the like beneath your feet if you happen to be outdoors. It is all chemical compounds of different kinds. You probably don't pay much attention to them, especially the air, but they are there and they are constantly interacting. Iron rusts due to interactions with oxygen, stone erodes because of acids, all constantly becoming something else. For a moment, try to forget all the things in your surroundings as separate entities and see them for what they are, masses of molecules of varying density, like an ocean where some parts are clear, like the air, while others are like blocks of ice wafting in the currents, those being solid objects. You are just another part of that ocean of chemicals, a little swirl constantly interacting with surrounding currents, a wave in an ocean that does not realize it is a wave. Hold that thought. Moving on to biology, the first field of science that has a lot to say about humans. Let us study ourselves with the mindset of someone versed in biological views and theories. Do you think we can find a cell within ourselves if we look with the tools of biology? Let's see. We are all made of cells, which chemistry tells us consist of atoms, while physics informs us of the subatomic particles, meaning waves, and the forces keeping them together. Cells are separate entities, yet in the bodies of multicellular organisms they have evolved to become so interdependent they would not survive on their own. The cells are born from information transmitted forward by the genes in the DNA of germ cells, sperm in males and eggs in females, so there would not be neurons or gut epithelia without the germ cells, but without gut epithelia, those germ cells would be left without nutrition. Without neurons, there would be no mating behavior, or hardly any behavior of any kind. So, without one type of cell, there would not be the other. It is all interdependent, and they could not exist on their own by themselves. Also, when you are made up all these different cells working their specific purpose, can you really call yourself a single entity? I think it is more accurate to think of yourself as a mass of cells all working together, because that is how they have adapted to survive in these surroundings. And that is only taking in consideration the cells, but that is hardly all that we are made of. There is also the microbiota. Our skin, gut, bowels and so on are covered with bacteria. In fact, quantitatively there are more bacteria in our bodies than there are cells, with the amount of cells given between 30 to 40 trillion cells compared to 10 to 100 trillion bacteria. The bacteria are also much more varied. The human genome has 22,000 genes in its entire genome, while the human gut microbiome, meaning the genome of the microbiota, had 3.3 million non-redundant genes. We get this microbiome dynamically from the environment as we grow. When we are born, we are covered in the bacteria of the vaginal canal, unless we were delivered with a caesarean section. We continue to accumulate bacteria from breast milk and later food, so associating with our parent and interacting with our environment changes our composition on a biological level as well, not just chemical. It has been shown that microbes from our environment can transmit new genes into our gut microbiome, which can code for different ways to digest compounds we could not digest previously. These new tools may cause one to develop obesity, as they have more energy at their disposal, so their body changes due to a change in their microbiota makeup. For example, it is due to a certain gene in a certain gut bacteria that the Japanese can digest a certain seaweed, while Americans cannot. The microbiota has also been shown to affect our brains and behavior. It is fair to say much of who we are is because of our brain, where the majority of our personality, memories, mental capabilities and so on resides. I say the majority because so much affects the brain it is, in my view, impossible to separate it from the rest completely. The gut microbiota affecting our central nervous system is just one example. For example, different lactobacilli have been shown to improve mood and change activity of the brain during an attention task. Mood and attention define a lot of how it is like to be you. So wouldn't you also say that you are part bacteria and their effects, and those bacteria would not be there without the gut cells, that would not be there without the other cells, and so on until we run out of cell types. It is all interdependent, none can exist on their own by themselves. And that is just the bacteria we can swab of our membranes and study. But what about the bacteria within our very cells? You have probably heard of mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. But did you know that, according to the most popular theory, they were not originally part of eukaryotic cells, meaning cells that have a nucleus like ours, but were prokaryotes, so like bacteria, that early cells let move inside them to provide them with energy. Just one more example of different entities working in symbiosis to form a larger whole that forgets all the little guys making itself up and starts thinking he is all there is. The microbiota is part of the mainstream now, but there is also the human virome, meaning all the viruses we carry with us in and on our bodies. Their number is roughly the same amount as bacteria. Viruses can be found in gut, mouth, skin, blood and even cerebrospinal fluid. They interact not only with us cells but with the bacteria as well, influencing the function of our immune system. Further study is needed to unveil more data on the effect of the virome on us. So yet again we fail to find anything we can point at as the self, as separate entity, and instead we seem to be a mass of little critters, all working in tandem for their own survival. And you can't say survival in biology without thinking about natural selection and evolution. Evolution, just to be clear, means the concept that living beings have developed somehow, while natural selection is the most widely accepted and known mechanism of evolution in nature. To quickly summarize, organisms are born with slightly different qualities that make them more or less fit for their surroundings, and the ones that prosper are more likely to transmit their genes, so the next generations will have more of that quality. Natural selection is not the only way to make animals change in some direction. In fact, Charles Darwin got some of his ideas from pigeon breeders who knew even at his time that by selecting birds by their specific qualities, they could enrich that quality by making birds with the desired quality breed with one another. The key here is the fact natural selection works to adapt a species to its surroundings. So we too have been molded by our surroundings and are not separate from it. Our eyes face forward because our ancestors needed to see the distance from one tree branch to the next correctly, and later this was useful when hunting. Specific foods entice us because that's what we've developed to eat. We are afraid of the dark because there used to be predators there. Afraid of being alone because we had better chances in groups. You cannot extricate yourself from your surroundings and the history of our species. Genes pass down from our ancestors, and in the view of biology, you are just a current wave in that stream. A wave made of smaller waves of microorganisms constantly interacting with the surrounding microorganisms that are everywhere, a veritable ocean of them flowing in and out of your body. The same goes for larger organisms, the predators that used to hunt us, as well as our parasites. Our domesticated animals and plants and pathogens constantly interact with one another, shifting the evolution and adapting of other organisms in different directions, like sea currents smashing together and forming a turbulent sea of interactions that we are part of, like a wave in an ocean that does not realize it is a wave. Hold that thought. You may have been shouting this whole time, but what about psychology? A valid question. After all, if there was one branch of science that could point out the self and explain it with its theories, it would certainly be psychology. So let us look into psychology, followed closely by neuroscience, which is saved last since it is the youngest of the bunch. So what does psychology have to say about the self? Quite a lot. And I'm not going to go through every claim here either, just the most common views and the ones with the most cash value for our purposes. And the field of psychology dedicated to exploration of the self is, obviously enough, called self-psychology. Its grandmaster and originator is Heinz Kohut, who did his work in the 1970s and 1980s. And wouldn't you know, his theory postulated that there is no separate self, but a self-object which has function and experience. The self is then understood not as a preformed psychic structure, but as an ever-changing set of capabilities emerging from relation to other people and our surroundings. Capabilities such as awareness, attachment and affect. The self is seen and described as fluid. What a coincidence that the word also describes the stuff of waves. In short, something like the self develops as a child from having one's needs fulfilled. A child, according to this theory, requires acknowledgement and affirmation, and this leads to feelings of being capable, which turn to ambition. A failure of the parent to fulfill the child's needs leads to a negative sense of self. So, according to this view, the self is built largely by how outside forces affect us, like pouring in the ingredients of a self. And if one gets enough, their sense of self reaches health and maturity. This theory has been updated since its birth, and some parts of it still remain unclear, such as the exact meaning of self-object, a term integral to the theory. Kohut's self-psychology mainly deals with a process of psychoanalysis, an entirely separate field of psychology called the psychology of self, studies identity, the subject of experience, the concept of the self. The terms self-concept, self-esteem and self-perception are closely related but differ in their meaning. Self concept is generally regarded as one's view on oneself, so it answers the question, who am I? One's self-concept can be assessed with, for example, 20 statements test. The answers suggest that we often define ourselves by our appearance. For example, I am 6 feet tall, I am dark-haired, are biographical details. For example, I am the son of a surgeon, stating our social roles. For example, I am married, I am a pianist, specifying our political, ethnic or religious group. For example, I am a conservative, I am Jewish, and so on, listing our virtues and vices. For example, I am honest, I am lazy, or locating our place in the grand scheme of things. For example, I am human, I am a rational animal. Notice again how this is just multitude of data, much of which is just our relation to other things. When tasked to describe themselves, people list all these variables, but is that really who we are? Are you really your body? Imagine in the future that your brain could be transplanted to another body. Would you not consider that to be you because it has your memories and personality despite having a different body? Your body has also changed considerably as you have aged. Again, we find nothing concrete, just a network of connecting things that seem to connect at one point, the self, but that point still cannot be found. Self-esteem means our views and feelings on our potential, how efficacious we consider ourselves to be. The definition of self-perception proved surprisingly difficult to find in literature, but what I gleaned from the studies was it can be thought of as how well we perceive our real state. For example, people who suffer from the extreme eating disorder anorexia nervosa, where they essentially starve themselves, see themselves as more obese than they are in reality. It has been shown in functional MRI studies that parts of their brain responsible for processing their own image activates differently compared with healthy people, while activation is the same between both groups when looking at pictures of other people. So the visual self-perception of an anorexia patient is disturbed, and it appears they quite literally see themselves as fatter than they are. So self-perception can be thought of as how we see ourselves. Our perception might not be in line with objective reality, or as objective as we can assume reality to get. Another example of self-perception gone awry is the Dunning-Kruger effect, where people with no information about a subject present a lot of opinions as valid since they don't even know how little they know. Their self-perception when it comes to their expertise in the area is low. What I find interesting about self-perception is that it seems to me to be the closest of what is often meant as the self, the subject of experience. It is the part or function of us that tells us how we are doing, evaluates how well we did, and so on. For example, you might have a concept of yourself that is something like, I am a football player, while your self-perception might be, I am someone who enjoys and is good at football. There is a subtle difference. The other is an idea which can be thought to be stored somewhere in the brain, while the other is an evaluation of sorts. But who is doing the evaluating? Wouldn't that be the self? But just like the previous example with anorexia patient showed, it is not some self part of the brain that lights up in the imagining, but the extrastriate body area located in the right lateral temporal lobe, which has the highly specific function of activating when receiving images of bodies but not faces. Interestingly, there is another part of the brain called fusiform body area, which activates selectively on images of bodies without the face. But that is beyond the scope of this discussion, so it seems our perceptions about ourselves cannot be attributed to some specific self part of the brain, but are distributed all around in various locations with oddly specific functions. Part of the self in psychology of the self is also the social self, which is the self we show to others. I won't go deeper into this since it is something that only exists in relation to others, and as such is obviously not the kind of real, concrete and independent self that we are trying to locate, just more separate determinations, behaviors and tidbits that seem to connect at a specific point, the self, but the point keeps eluding us. But these are not the only views psychology has to offer us. Carl Jung, a student of Sigmund Freud, both famous in the field of psychology, described what he termed the collective unconscious. This collective unconscious is like a storehouse in common to all humanity, where common predispositions and patterns of behavior arise. One example of a concept stored in the collective unconscious are the archetypes, which can be taught as inherited from our ancestors. For example, the archetype of a jester appears in different mythologies all around the world. This theory too can be seen as comparing us to a wave in an ocean. There is a larger whole beneath, and we are just small parts of it, whether we realize it or not. So it seems we do not find a single separate self here either. In fact, this is the outcome many researchers and thinkers before have arrived at. The modern explanation is that the self is created from the interplay of all kinds of different brain functions that relate to the self, such as self-recognition, self-concept, self-esteem, autobiographical memories of the self, the social self, awareness of one's own internal processes, and so on. The self emerges from all these lower level functions, and that is why it is called an emergent property. It is not that the self came first and started ordering all these other functions around. Instead, it appeared from all these various capabilities, synchronizing with one another, creating a central point that organizes them into a coherent whole. Still, it would appear that organizer is missing. If you take away the parts that make it, there's nothing left. Because of this view of the self as an emergent property born of lower level properties working in tandem in their separate tasks, the self has been likened to a society, like in the year 2000 article Society of Self, the emergence of collective properties in self-structure. Just like a society is formed of numerous people organizing into systems that then complement or compete with one another, so can the different aspects of the brain and mind be taught to interact in the limited space they have. Here too, it is pointed out how these different aspects are not born out of nothing, but in relation to the outside world. For example, our knowledge of ourselves is influenced by comparison with others. Now that we have brought society into the mix, I think the next field of science we should take a look at is sociology, but I don't think more than a mention is necessary, as the field studies societies, groups of people. In the field of sociology, the view that an individual is just part of a larger mass is central to the whole concept. For example, rather than seeing individuals, sociology most often considers people as representatives of a group, for example men, women, Norwegians, and those with higher education, alcoholics, those from poor background, and so on. Maybe I am simplifying things too much, but sociology truly sees a person as just one part of a larger mass, a wave in an ocean, whether they understand their wavedom or not. Last but certainly not the least comes neuroscience. We did venture into its area, dipped our toes slightly into the neuroscience pool when I mentioned MRI studies of the brain, but let us now take a closer look into the area and see if it will deliver us from our problem and finally point out where the self resides. Show us an image of the theater where this elusive conductor leads the show. Instead of the self, neuroscience studies its neural correlates, meaning functions, structures, and phenomena of the brain that are associated with the various aspects of the self. Of particular interest is self-awareness, which could be thought of the subject of experience, and that would be the self. It is also the function binding other conscious experiences into a single construct with a sense of unity of consciousness. And lo and behold, a group of researchers has apparently localized this function of self-awareness in our brains. According to the 2016 article entitled Towards a Cognitive Neuroscience of Self-Awareness, they assert that self-awareness is generated by a paralimbic network of medial prefrontal/anterior and medial parietal/posterior cingulate hubs and associated regions linked to each other with 40 Hz, and that is gamma wave frequencies, and regulated by our favorite neurotransmitter dopamine. From this, does it not follow that our very existence, being aware of ourselves, means to grasp and want? A question that would make a Buddhist smile smugly. Disrupting this network has also been shown to hamper our self-awareness, so the evidence is solid. Self-awareness, of course, does not account for all of our self-related sensations. It is more of an observer taking account of the actual self-related considerations themselves. Also, turns out the self is not a single part or a function, but itself a network of functions. Still, hats off to neuroscience for pointing out at least one part forming the illusion of ourself. But that is just a view of cognitive neuroscience. Turns out there are many fields to neuroscience, one of them being cultural neuroscience, which studies how our surroundings and culture affects us with the tools and approach of neuroscience. Again, we find an example how our surroundings change who we are, this time in the form of culture affecting the very makeup and workings of our brains. For example, the West values independence and individuality, while in China, close others are almost inseparable. And this is true all the way to the cortical level. In Western people, the medial prefrontal cortex lights up when they think about themselves, but not when they think of others, even loved ones. In comparison, when a Chinese person thinks about their close others, their medial prefrontal cortex lights up similarly to how it does when they consider themselves. A cultural view literally changes how our brain works, and who can then tell which one came first, the chicken or the egg? Meaning, do our brains work this way because of what our culture has taught us to believe, or is our culture the way it is because of our brain's inner workings? It sounds to me like yet another case of the individual being just part of a larger whole, a wave in the ocean, pushed in unpredictable directions by the surrounding currents. We have just gone through a plethora of different fields of science and what they have to tell us about ourselves. What we found out, or at least what I aimed to point out, was that no matter what perspective you take, the self proves difficult to pinpoint. Modern Western science is by and large materialistic, and some fields more than others. Physics and chemistry in their current state had little to offer in terms of the contents of our minds, but we still learned how we are not separate entities, but made of parts, that themselves are made of parts, and it is accurate to think of us as points in a large, even all-encompassing field, like waves in an ocean. We then moved to science that dealt more and more with humans, and specifically the human mind. There too, our search for a single, separate and unchanging self proved fruitless. Most of us would say that the self resides somewhere in our brain, yet from biology we learned that our brain is affected by our bodies, which consists not only of cells, but also of bacteria and even viruses which affect our brains. Raises the question which part of our personality and capabilities that we hold so integral and essential for ourselves is actually the effect of bacteria. Our bodies are also not separate entities, but in constant exchange with our surroundings, molded and shaped by it. And take away the cells and there is no body left. And take away the things that make up those cells and there will be no cells and therefore no body. And this way it is shown that everything is just the sum of the parts that make it, but sometimes the added effects appears more than just the sum. The self is considered one such emergent property, and that is born out of the simpler functions as something more complex. Self-awareness, self-esteem, self-regulation, self-concept, all these things make up the self. Take them away and there would be no self. And the same applies to the pieces themselves. Self-esteem, for example, is shaped by our surroundings, the upbringing we received as a child, the balance of our neurotransmitters and so on. The parts are made of parts in a chain that seems never ending. And when you take a deep look into any specific area, it seems like there's nothing there but a sum of parts. And when you study the parts themselves, you find them empty of real content as well, and are left with more parts. As the only field outside of science in this episode, I would like to talk about some central views in the Eastern philosophy of Buddhism. Born from the teaching of the Buddha some 2500 years ago in ancient India, it has captured the interest of many researchers, ranging from quantum physicists to neuroscientists and even ethnobotanists. This is because the insight it has provided seems uncanny in its wisdom. One of the most unique and essential teachings in Buddhism is the concept of emptiness. What this means that no object, feeling, idea and so on exist separately, but is made of parts. When you apply this to a person, you get the concept of no self, meaning there is no self, just different parts that we mistakenly believe to make up a self. In Buddhism, these are the body, feeling, perception, consciousness, and mental objects. When we grasp at these, suffering and anguish follows. On the other hand, when we understand they are made of some kinds of parts, all affecting one another, we can take a more positive approach and feed the qualities we want by providing it with the parts and prerequisites that make it up. To link this with our current episode, you might come to understand that some negative feeling you have is caused by the negativity of those surrounding you, as your surroundings constantly influence and shape us if we are not mindful. The solution then would be to stop those outside negative ideas from getting to you while developing more positive views and thoughts. The concept of emptiness and no self mean that we are just our parts. And just like in the laws of thermodynamics, energy cannot be destroyed, our parts don't disappear when we die. We also live on in our offspring, as well as the memories of us people have and the change we have brought upon the world. Once one has truly understood and accepted the concept of emptiness, one ceases to fear death, as they realize it is also empty. Why I brought it up is because of a famous Buddhist parable that is often employed to describe this concept. We won't go too deep into the concept of emptiness at this point in time. You can research emptiness on your own if you are interested. A good source for a start might be, for example, the book The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh. The parable I mentioned is the parable of a wave in an ocean. Imagine a wave in an ocean. It seems to have a beginning and an end, but at the same time it is water. Once the wave disappears from sight, it has simply returned to the ocean and still exists even when we cannot see it. In the Buddhist view, a person who believes themselves to be an individual separate from their surroundings is like a wave that does not realize it is made of water and is part of the ocean. And as we have seen, this view finds heavy support in many fields of modern science. So, in this episode we have torn the traditional view of the self that you probably held to pieces. Our self is not separate, not unchanging, but formed of various factors, shaped by functions of our brains, bodies, influence of our surroundings, such as our culture, upbringing we received, and so on and so on. The next question on your mind should be, what do I do with this information? Excellent question. I would not have gone through all this explanation if it was simply theoretical musings with no practical value. On the contrary, as I have stated before, this podcast considers those ideas best and worth studying that have practical applications, ideas with the most cash value. In the service of that goal, I once again showed how ancient, tried and tested philosophy of Buddhism and modern science both converge on this issue, giving credibility to the conclusion. The benefits that can be reaped of this view of no self are enormous. In Buddhism, realizing that your self is empty of real content is considered becoming enlightened. That is the so-called nirvana. Some get enormous benefit from this idea. They are liberated from worldly suffering and freed of the thirst of craving. I am not one of those people. I see their point, but it just does not translate into more freedom and liberation. Just thinking that myself is non-existent produces no great change in my level of happiness. And that is okay. Buddha himself said that you should not take any teaching to be true just because of its importance to others. If this way of looking at yourself, meaning thinking it is empty of content, does not produce immediate relief in you, don't worry, it does not work for everyone. But there are other ways to look at the matter of no self, and it is one I am very excited about. When I combined it with some other ideas from Buddhism, other philosophies and modern neuroscience, I did have a breakthrough on my personal path of liberation. This other way of looking at emptiness really changed my outlook on life. It holds enormous cash value, and I hope you are not too tired to listen, since it can be of enormous benefit to you as well. The idea is simply that since all our characteristics are empty, meaning they are made of parts, then we have to change those parts to change the thing we wish to develop. Think of a tree. It is made of bark, branches, leaves, roots, and so on, which are made of cells. How do you make a tree grow? You give it water, nutrients, and sunlight, which are utilized by the cells to create more tree. To give a human example, let's say someone wishes to improve their mood since they often feel depressed. How do you make one's mood grow, meaning improve? You give it the nutrients that make it up. And since so many things both inside and outside our bodies affect us, there are numerous things we can change. Some of the multitude of things that have shown to be effective include physical exercise, weight loss, different kinds of therapy, mindfulness, quitting overuse of alcohol and drugs, pharmaceuticals, and so on. When you understand what makes you up, improving different areas of yourself, or even fixing things that don't work as well as you would hope, becomes much easier. If you still have a hard time wrapping your head around yourself not existing as you thought, don't worry, it does take some getting used to, some mulling things over. Another common point of confusion is the difference between illusion and non-existence. Depending on the interpretation, some say that the self is an illusion, while others consider it to be non-existent. I would be in the first group. Illusion does not mean that something does not exist. It means it is something other than what it looks like at first. When you look at an optical illusion on paper, the fact it is an illusion does not mean that the paper and image don't exist. It means that you have to look at the image in an out of ordinary way. The same in my view applies to the self. It is not how it appears at first glance. In one of the studies mentioned earlier, the self was likened to a society since it consists of various segments carrying out their functions. I would like to compare the self to a sports team with you, as long as you are mindful and using your higher cognitive functions for goal-oriented behavior as the coach of the team. You have to make everyone play well together and bring out the best of every single player to lead the team to victory. Similarly, using mindfulness of your state, evaluating your situation and planning out your goals, you can make your various different functions all work towards your goals and maximize their use, meaning improve your mood, energy, self-esteem, alertness, physical performance, general happiness, and so on. Realizing that there is not just one self to develop, but a whole team of what could be considered separate entities makes planning out your path of improvement easier and more approachable. In Buddhism, the parts of ourself, as mentioned earlier, are body, perceptions, feelings, mental objects, and consciousness. In the next episodes, I will be detailing how we can use mindfulness of these so-called aggregates for improvement. I will be starting with the most tangible and visible one, the body. So tune in to the next episode to learn simple yet effective ways you can use your new talent of mindfulness with your newfound understanding of yourself, or lack thereof, to use your body to achieve many different changes in the body. For example, I will be explaining how to use your body to improve mood, confidence, alertness, creativity, strength output, and much more. So, if you want to make full use of your mortal coil, tune in next time to the Mindset Thoughts. And, as always, memento, cerebrum formare. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mindset Thoughts. I hope you found it informative and the lessons and practices spoken in it relevant to your situation. I also hope you found it as entertaining to listen as I found making it to be. If you found it beneficial, be sure to follow Mindset Thoughts on Spotify as well as on YouTube, where you can also give us a thumbs up. Also, make sure to check out our Discord server for further discussion, where you can contact me directly. Links in description and channel information. There you can also find the link to my book, which I have self-published on Amazon, called Death Drive. If speculative dystopian near-future sci-fi sounds like a cup of tea, getting the book is a great way to support my work as an author. So have a nice day and memento, cerebrum formare.